Thanks, Dylan.
Good evening, and thank you for viewing the September 22nd, 2020 meeting of the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission meeting is being held as a webinar in response to local efforts to reduce the spread of the COVID-19 virus. I want to start by thanking the community and visitors to Arcata and the county for their efforts to slow the spread of COVID-19. We are leading by doing. We are masking up to protect the community and visitors, masking up to protect each other and the most vulnerable in our community, and practicing social distance. These two fundamental acts of social responsibility will help flatten the curve, keep ourselves and neighbors healthy, and keep our businesses open, not to mention supporting frontline essential workers that serve us daily. If you wish to make public comment during the meeting, either at the two open public comment periods or for an individual agenda item, there are two ways to do so. Number one, if you are logged in onto the Zoom meeting webinar, click on raise your hand on the right-hand side of your screen. When it is time for public comment on the item on which you wish to speak, the clerk will unmute you. You will have 2 minutes to comment. Or number two, you can access the meeting by phone. Call the number at the bottom of the screen. Enter meeting ID, also at the bottom of the screen. Press *9 on your phone. This will raise your hand. When it is time for public comment on the item on which you wish to speak, the clerk will unmute your phone. You will hear a prompt that will indicate your phone is unmuted. You will have 2 minutes to comment. You may also submit written comment via email addressed to pc@cityofarcata.org. Your email will be forwarded to the Planning Commission, but commissioners may not receive your comments before deliberating or rendering a decision if the decision is made the day of your comment. Can we begin with a call to order? A roll call, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Commissioner Davies?
Here.
Commissioner Mayer? I'm sorry, Vice Chair Mayer?
Here.
Commissioner White?
Here.
Commissioner Barstow? Commissioner Barstow is present. Commissioner Becerra Elcock?
Here.
And Commissioner Figueroa?
Here.
And Chair Tagby?
Here, thank you.
All present.
Now we move on to the consent calendar. We have no minutes, but we do have a consideration of a zoning interpretation. If there's no objections or comments, then do we have a motion on this item?
Commissioner Barstow?
Yeah, I think the opinion is perfectly fine, but it does point up the fact that this fence limit table needs to be made more clear. Because reading the table, it sounds like fences that are 6 feet and up to 10 feet can be reviewed. But it says nothing about, or 6 feet to 8 feet. It says nothing about the possibility of the fence to be over 8 feet. And if it's over 8 feet, it probably needs review. But it's something I think we can put on our list of things to address in the future when we're cleaning up the land use code.
So just as a,
Yeah, go ahead.
after you.
Does it work for you to pass this item knowing that we're going to go back to it later? Is this a likely agenda item at some point? And John, does that work for you, or do you want to pull the item from the consent calendar?
Oh, no, I'm perfectly fine with it. No need to pull it this time. I just was hoping we'd note that sometime in the future we should look at that.
Okay. Then do we have a motion to approve?
Excuse me, I did not receive that item in the packet that I picked up at City Hall the other day. And so I've been unable to review it, and yeah.
Okay.
Do other commissioners have the consent calendar item missing from their packet? Judy, you don't have, Commissioner Mayor, you don't have packet page number 5?
I guess I should have looked at those numbers and said, oh, I'm missing pages 3 through 6. And I didn't do that. So no, I don't have that. Sorry.
Would you like to pull the consent calendar item to discuss how to proceed, or do you have a motion to approve?
Is that a question of Commissioner Mayor?
I guess that's a question of the commission. In general, you can either proceed with a motion to approve the consent calendar item, or you can pull it from the agenda to discuss and determine whether or not you wish to delay action on it so that all commissioners have the benefit of it. And staff can maybe present a brief staff report to get a comfort level.
I'm also willing to abstain on this.
Well, Commission, are there others that feel like they have enough information to move forward on this item? If there was one abstention, we could sure still pass it. How does the commission feel? John says yes.
It would just take a motion to find out.
Okay. All right. So
I'll make a motion to accept the zoning interpretation regarding the fence height design review process with the intention of coming back and clarifying it later.
So I'm sorry, the motion would be to approve the consent calendar.
As is.
Generally, consent calendar items don't have any discussion at all on them, so
Yeah.
we've kind of crossed that threshold.
So we have a motion to approve the consent calendar as presented. Do we have a second?
I'll second that.
We have a motion and a second. We'll take a roll call on approval.
Commissioner White?
David? Go ahead, David.
Commissioner White?
Aye.
Commissioner Barstow?
Aye.
Commissioner Vasade-Elcock?
Aye.
Commissioner Figueroa?
Aye.
Commissioner Davies?
Aye.
Vice Chair Mayor?
Abstain.
And Chair Tagney.
Aye. Motion carries. Thank you. So now we can move on to our public hearings, of which we have none. And then to our business items. And I'm looking for a motion to amend the agenda. Now, it's been suggested that we flip these two items. If any commissioners will approve that, then we're looking for a motion on that.
I'll make a motion to amend the agenda.
A second.
We have a motion and a second. Would you like to do a roll call, David?
Yes, and for the record, was that Vice Chair Mayor that seconded?
Yes.
Okay. Commissioner Vasade-Elcock?
Yes.
Commissioner Figueroa?
Yes.
Commissioner Barstow?
Yes.
Commissioner White?
Yes.
Commissioner Davies?
Yes.
Vice Chair Mayor?
Yes.
And Chair Tagney.
Yes. And now we're looking for any ex parte disclosures of any of the commissioners on this item, which will be the comment on land use code text amendment to cannabis innovation zone. Commissioner Davies?
Yes, I would like to recuse myself from this discussion as have business and I'm on a board that is affected by this business.
Okay, thank you. And it's my understanding in this situation, you would be put into the waiting room and we'll see you back in a little while.
I'll be here.
Okay, thank you. We're waiting for that transaction, right? The waiting room?
Yes. Hang tight. Okay.
All right. Do we have a staff report on this business item?
Yes, good evening. My name is Joe Mateer, Senior Planner. I'll be presenting tonight's business item, which is to allow the Commission to review the city cannabis policies and make recommendations for staff to consider and incorporate into a recommendation to the Council. The draft ordinance that you'll find as Attachment B would increase the number of use permits in Area 2 of the Cannabis Innovation Zone from 20 to 30, as directed earlier by Council. It would also revise the definition of cannabis cultivation to exclude cannabis plant nurseries. Staff intends to bring back a Planning Commission resolution at a notice public hearing on October 13th and the City Council for their action in November. I'd be happy to answer any questions for the Council or the Commission, and that's it for my presentation.
All right. Are there any commission questions on that staff report? David, John, was that a raised hand? No. If there are no comments, questions, concerns about this, then we should be looking for a motion.
In fact, on this particular item, I don't believe we need a motion. This was just an informational. The real issue at hand was that the Planning Commission at the last time you took this item up made several recommendations of code changes that they felt the council should consider. The council really narrowly focused on the number of permits. And so we wanted to make sure that you had an opportunity to deliberate before you see the draft ordinance and to get a report back from staff about the council's action, so that you understood that we didn't just completely blow you off, but that there was a rationale for why we're coming back with an ordinance that's only going to change the number of total permits that are allowed. So if you have nothing to comment on, that's fine. We'll bring it back when it's noticed.
Okay. Thanks for the clarity. No commission comments at this point. Anybody? No. Okay. Seeing none, we'll move on. And are you going to bring Mr. Davies back?
Indeed. And just before we start the next item, I'll note that we do have two new attendees who I believe missed the instructions on how to participate. And just for those attendees, if you, at the appropriate time, when it's time for public comment, wish to comment, if you'll just raise your hand, we'll let you into the meeting to speak. Would you like me to start on that?
Okay, sorry. No, I didn't realize we were all here. Okay, so business item number 2 is the local coastal program public review. Do we have a staff report on that?
Absolutely. Thank you, Chair Tagney. Before you tonight, we're taking up the second business item, second hearing meeting on the local coastal program update that we're currently working to get to hearing for approval and to the Coastal Commission for their certification, hopefully. And you should anticipate seeing this series run through the adoption sometime early next year. Each of your meetings will be discussing different sections of the local coastal program. As you recall, our last meeting, the first, discussed the LCP architecture and the way that it fits within the other body of policy and zoning. This hearing will be taking up procedural matters and standards that are included for all permit types. And then next we'll be moving into hearings or public meetings that go into specific resource issues. And then finally, we'll put the capstone on this project and talk about sea level rise sometime likely in December, early January. Throughout that time, we'll also be bringing forward the coastal land use element, which is largely the body of policy that supports this zoning that we're going to be reviewing. So I have provided the sections of the local coastal program that include the introduction chapter, the general developments chapter, and coastal development permits chapter. Last time we took up the planning and locating developments. You'll notice a gap in the packet here for chapter what's labeled 2.12 in your table of contents. And so if you would like to, over time, as we're going through these, you can start building your own draft of the zoning ordinance, the coastal zoning ordinance, by compiling these planning commission meetings together. And so now you should have at your disposal everything from 2.10 to 2.16 available to you. So just real quick, I wanted to talk briefly about the introduction. Commissioner and Vice Chair Mayer had requested that we come back with a table of contents so you can see what is the structure of this document. And so starting on packet page 11, we have the table of contents. It discusses the items that we'll be reviewing in this zoning ordinance. Starting off with the introduction is pretty basic stuff. If we get into deliberations on chapter 2.110, it'll probably look a lot like paint drying. But we can discuss those matters if you wish. There's definitely some procedural information in here of note, specifically the idea that this coastal zoning ordinance supersedes any other ordinance for the purposes of issuing coastal development permits. So that kind of sets up the hierarchy of our zoning ordinances. Chapter 2.14 has general development standards. Again, I'm going to skip over this unless you have any specific questions. But the idea being here that these standards apply to all coastal development permits, regardless of what the impacts are. We just wanted to provide sort of the baseline for certain things like parking, lighting and ESHA, et cetera. And then the coastal development permit chapter really gets into the procedural matters of how we issue coastal development permits, what the noticing requirements are, the types of findings and conditions that would be necessary to approve a coastal development permit. Goes into time limits on appeals and how long permits would be active. Talks a little bit about enforcement and penalties as well as emergency permits. And I'm not going to go into depth on this, but I did want to highlight just a couple of really important facets of this update. The first is that you'll note on packet page 31, I've left a gap. Packet page 31 starting discusses our categorical exclusion order, which was adopted when we adopted the current LCP back in 1989. Categorical exclusion order E88-3, I've actually included in your appendix or in your attachments rather. It's attachment C, so you can read through the text that the Coastal Commission actually adopted, their staff report and whatnot. I've also included the attachment B is the map of the categorical exclusion areas. Now in your paper packet, it clipped only an 8.5 by 11 section of it. So I'm going to encourage you to take a look at the electronic version or come into the office if you want to get a look at a full-size paper version. What happens inside these categorical exclusion areas is that several different permit types or several different activities don't require a permit. And so if you look at the CADX order and which is your attachment B, starting on packet page 49. If you turn to packet page 50, it lists out the types of categories of excluded development. These would be types of development that within the coastal zone do not require a coastal development permit. And this was from the original staff report to the Coastal Commission. The staff report modified some of the areas that we had originally identified as being within that categorical exclusion area. And so if you look at the packet pages 57 to 59, you'll actually get a close-up of those stippled areas. Those are the properties where if you have any of these activities going on that are exempt from having to get a coastal development permit. So that, if you turn back now to our draft, as I pointed out, there were some gaps in what we included in that categorical exclusion area. I need to work with our coastal staff, Coastal Commission staff, local staff, to navigate how we port those exclusions into our current document, because language has changed slightly. And so I'm not quite ready to present that to the commission. We'll bring it back to you when we do have that. But in essence, what we're attempting to do is to amend our local coastal program overall, do a comprehensive update of that local coastal program, but not at this time amend the categorical exclusion order. And so we're still working on piecing those together. So that's why there's a gap on packet page 32 and 33. So that'll be amended back in when we resolve those issues. Does that make sense? Any questions about that?
Yeah, I have a question. I've been struggling with this map, and I'm glad that you clarified it a bit. But what I really don't understand is the area which I think is South G Street that's not stippled.
Yes.
And why it's excluded from the stippled exclusion zone. I get that it's partly residential, but there's other residential that is stippled. So is there any rhyme or reason to that, or do we just accept it as is?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And the answer is that the categorical exclusion area were areas that the Coastal Commission felt like were already developed with urban development, and also weren't likely to have coastal impacts if there was further development on that. These had to be within our permit jurisdiction to be effective. And as you'll note, there's sort of that darker line that represents the slough that goes through and behind those properties. All of the area within 100 feet from that slough channel are retained by the Coastal Commission in their permit jurisdiction. And so those areas, even though they meet the first criteria that they're within existing developed urban areas, they're outside of our permit jurisdiction.
So effectively, it's because of the proximity to the slough, right?
Yeah, and the fact that those properties are still within the Coastal Commission's retained jurisdiction. So those people would not come to us for a coastal development permit. They would have to go to the state.
Wow. Okay. Thank you.
And I can bring back information on the retained jurisdiction versus the city's jurisdiction at our next meeting, if that's of interest. The other notable feature about this this section is that the waiver process. If you look on packet page 39, we worked with coastal staff to incorporate a similar process that the Coastal Commission has for their permits, where if you come in with an application and you can demonstrate that, hey, look, this is a minor project, it doesn't have any impacts on coastal resources, will you allow us to have a waiver from a coastal development permit and not have to obtain one? We asked for a similar process And to be honest, I didn't really hold my breath that we'd be able to get one. But they said, sure, yeah, other jurisdictions have done this before. I don't know why we never incorporated it into ours, because there were several coastal development permits we found ourselves issuing that, you know, were just additional procedural steps to get to the same conclusion we would have gotten to with a waiver process. So I'm just really excited about the, you know, the possibility for our community to be able to adopt this this waiver process. There are certain findings that we need to make, and we have to make notice of the waiver. So there's still some steps that we have to go through, but it's simpler than having to go through a full coastal development permit. And so that's one feature I wanted to point out here. Other than that, I really, you know, there's a lot of material in here, and I'm not sure what maybe was of interest to the Planning Commission. I pointed to the things that I think were notable in the staff report here, and so I just want to open it up if you have any questions to answer those, and if there's any, you know, public comment on this. I wanted the Planning Commission to be able to hear that. I will also note, just before I end here, that we did send this information out. I sent it directly via email to a couple of stakeholders who I know are interested in these matters. But we're also pumping this information out through our e-notifications. We have a sea level rise e-notification, and we also have a major planning projects and long range planning e-notification. It's a city's listserv for those out in the community that are watching this program. I strongly encourage you to go to our website, cityofarcata.org, and follow the link. It's one of the main bars to e-notifications and sign up. It's a good way to get information about these kinds of meetings that may not be noticed in other venues, or you won't have to go and find them because we'll send you a notification about it. That's all I have prepared for tonight on this this topic.
Commissioner, questions or comments at this point?
Commissioner Vice Chair Mayer has a comment.
Yeah, I have some comments and a few questions. First, I'd like to thank you very much for providing this to us, and especially for providing that table of contents, which explains where it fits in the whole local coastal program. And then also for explaining, you know, which parts aren't really included there, including the categorical exclusion order of 1988, which was super confusing until you explained it. So I really appreciate that. I guess one of the things I kept thinking when I was reading through the procedural details of the coastal permit applications, waivers, public hearings, and what the zoning administrator would do, what the planning commission would do in the appeals process, was that in general, I would expect that the zoning criteria and the zoning rules would follow the local coastal program's land use sections. I mean, in general, we do expect that the zoning details will be subsidiary to the land use decisions and plans. And so it's hard to know how to approach reviewing the details of these zoning issues, even the procedural issues, without having discussed that or without having a draft of it in hand. And when I'm looking at the schedule that you've set forth for when the Planning Commission is going to be addressing these issues, it does appear that until we're at the public hearing stage, this is our only chance to really discuss the zoning in particular. I'm wondering if you could maybe explain that in a way that would put my mind at ease about this flip in the expected order of what comes first and what's subsidiary.
Can I try and reiterate to make sure I understand the question?
Sure.
So is your concern that the coastal land use element hasn't come before the zoning?
Well, I realize that these are all business items and that we're not having, the public hearings in which anyone's going to vote on anything yet. But it doesn't appear that we're going to be returning to consideration of this zoning until those public hearings. And, typically we would have that land use material to look at our bigger picture, and our zoning would be ways of implementing that. And so it seems that that order is flipped here in a way that makes it very difficult to make any sort of reasonable or intelligent substantive comments rather than just sort of procedural questions and considerations.
You're wondering then what the zoning designations for the properties would be?
Well, I'm wondering, usually when we designate zoning, when we change it, when we amend it, when we condition it, that should happen pursuant to a land use discourse, some form of consideration. We don't have that in hand, except for what we already have in our general plan and in a document that's now several decades old. So I'm just kind of wondering how you expect all of this to fit in together for our consideration before the formal public hearing stage.
Gotcha. We did discuss at our last meeting how the zoning would be handled and what the specific zoning districts would be. There's very few changes to the actual underlying, well, there's no change to the underlying zoning. And so the zoning map that we have, or I should say there are a few changes to the underlying zoning. The underlying zoning that we have is going to bleed through the coastal zoning, which will be an overlay. So we discussed last time how there'll be an overlay zone. So if you go and look at the coastal map right now and you see that, parcel is currently zoned residential medium density, for example, the coastal overlay on that residential medium density will be coastal residential medium.
I guess what I'm concerned about is that perhaps we should be reconsidering some of those zoning designations, but we can't really even consider that reconsideration without a land use element to do it through. In other words, we don't have that high level guidance beyond our general plan, which didn't consider things like sea level rise.
So I'm not sure how to resolve that concern other than, I can bring the zoning map, and if the Planning Commission wants to consider making, underlying zoning designation changes, we can certainly discuss that. The majority of, the vast majority of the lands within the coastal zone are actually zoned ag, and we're going to strongly recommend at the staff level that we not change those underlying zoning designations. They're at sort of like the optimal pre-sea level rise scenario zoning designation that allows some of the fewest types of developments. And so we propose that we retain those. The only other area that has a significant underlying zoning change that we've been discussing as a community is in the K Street corridor, where that area has been discussed for having an infill over the Arcata Gateway specific plan adopted, and I don't see any way to sync the zoning changes for that planning process with our local coastal program at this point. It's going to have to be an update to the local coastal program when we're ready to adopt that. And a lot of that's just depending on timelines for, for the various grant funding sources that we have to do this work.
Okay,
And
yeah.
so I'm not sure, we haven't really identified as a community any other desire to change zoning districts outside of that, so.
Well, but that's because we haven't really discussed the land use and general plan components of the local coastal program as a local coastal program. And I guess what I'm concerned about is in sort of ways that would be invisible or that would be considered ministerial by right development types of things that could happen now without that consideration and that could put additional lives at risk for things like flooding and seismic hazards in hazard areas for sea level rise and stuff like that. And by looking at the zoning without looking at any of those land use considerations, a bunch of those things become invisible. They're just going to happen because at the moment they appear to be ministerial and things that we can't do anything about. I guess I'm thinking in particular about the assumption that accessory dwelling units in some of these hazard areas, up to 2 additional units per parcel, would be approved by right. And yet they could put many more people at risk. Also, in past years, the SB2 designation that would allow emergency housing to go into some of these areas. I don't think anyone else was on the commission at the time when that went through, except I think Julie. We've said nothing about that, and it does seem as though that's something that we might want to consider. It could be that all of those areas, except for South G Street, are within the state's retained jurisdiction, and so it's irrelevant to us. But I haven't seen that analysis anywhere, and it's really hard to go ahead with that with our zoning before a detailed consideration of the land use.
I think we're probably going to find that no matter where you start with a comprehensive update, it's difficult to encompass the whole in each of its separate parts. And there's no way to have a meeting on the entire whole. And so I'm bringing forward the information as quickly as I can based on the elements of the program that are updated. I think it's premature to make assumptions about who's in a vulnerable area and who's not, and what the city's strategy will be for for protecting those areas that would be vulnerable if we didn't do something about it, for example. And I certainly think that there's going to be some iterative dialogue around these issues.
Okay.
So I guess I would encourage us as encourage the commission to, I can bring some zoning information to the fore, but I've kind of structured it in a way that we can discuss all of the issues, as they are available to us. And then I think by the time we get to, somewhere December or January, and we're having the discussions about sea level rise, which, frankly, it needs the most work, and I need to make sure that I've done everything I can to get as close to 100% agreement with our Coastal Commission staff as possible on that topic before having the conversation, with the commission. I think that's just sort of it plays well for all of us. And, it's not that we haven't had this conversation. I mean, we've frankly been having the conversation since 2000 when we first initiated the general plan amendment that was intended to be the coastal land use element as well.
Yeah.
And so, certainly things have changed. I mean, our knowledge and understanding about climate change has drastically changed since 2000, and certainly that does warrant, reconsideration. But I think that a lot of the discussions that we have had, both with the Planning Commission and with the community, we've addressed a lot of those concerns in the strategy that we're putting forth now. And this is sort of like, this is the end of the discussion. It's not the beginning of the discussion. So I think as we walk through this material, we'll start to cover familiar ground, and we'll be able to point back to the decision points that we had in the past that brought us to the point where we are now. So I understand fully what you're saying. I think it's good advice, and I will certainly try and bring elements of that forward as we as we start to review these different elements. But I also would encourage us to remember that it hasn't been done in a vacuum. We've definitely been bringing the information concurrent. How do we struggle with sea level rise, and what should we be doing for our housing policy as a result? And all of that's baked into the current coastal zoning ordinance and the land use element. But those are really good points. I'll bring something back with a little bit more tangible meat on the bones.
Thank you.
David, along those lines, I recall, I think it was the Samoa specific plan. Is that what that zoning change or planning change that was made years ago was called? And if so, where does that fit into sea level rise and this discussion of increased development in the coastal zone? The other property that I'm curious about is the one the city owns that's been cleaned up. Little Lakes, is that what it's called? Mm-hmm. Yeah. What the future development opportunities are, how's that zoned? Is it zoned right now besides industrial? I don't recall. I know that a lot of thought's gone into that property. And this, as Judith brings this up, and I think about looking at maps and how they have, how the maps overlap with zoning and sea level rise. On the night that we do discuss sea level rise, I assume we'll be looking at some maps, including perhaps the zoning of that area.
Absolutely, and we can certainly do a session on sea level rise before we get to actually reviewing what's in the coastal zoning ordinance. It's interesting because I was just looking at the number of presentations that we've done for various different outreach opportunities, and it's I've given the presentation myself more than 20 times. We've had probably upwards of 50 engagement activities with the community on sea level rise and have gotten fairly consistent direction. I mean, so I wouldn't say it's universal, but fairly consistent direction to approach sea level rise the way that we're proposing to. And just again, for a high level reminder and overview, the concept is that the city has done a lot of good work, everything from the most recent McDaniel Slough acquisition and conversion to all of the tidelands, all of the land, basically 90% of the land as you're driving north on Highway 101, the bottomlands that are just right next to Highway 101 there, the city purchased those, acquired them, thanks to the leadership of my colleague Mark Andre over the years, and the management team here at the city, supported by the city council. A lot of that was done for habitat purposes. And so, grants were secured to purchase those properties, to take them out of 100% industrial ag production and move them more into a blended model that has habitat restoration as an underlying value. All of that acquisition that we've done that's near the bay that will have a largest impact on from sea level rise, is pre-planned now. That's the first land that will be subsumed by sea level rise when it's no longer viable to maintain the levees. What we've referred to in the past as the South G Peninsula, the South G and H streets leading out to, at the very leading edge, the city's wastewater treatment plant, is all built up on fill. And so if you look if you go stand on any one of those properties, you're going to look down to the adjacent properties. You're going to look down into the sloughs. You're going to look down into the bottomlands, the ag lands. And just as with the McDaniel Slough project, where we did a huge restoration project, but it also incorporated some levees to help maintain that habitat and also protect the city in the future as sea levels are rising. You can just take that concept and replicate it throughout that peninsula, which is already, at elevations above where, in some places above where sea level is projected to be in 70 years. And so with that idea in mind, the city has developed a concept that will use, living shorelines, what we've referred to as eco levees, which are, expanded living shoreline that will, be a first line of defense. That first line of defense is only going to last so long. We all know that we can only build to a certain point before you'd have to engineer a structure to try and keep the waters at bay. And so the next phase is really to start to, encroach back in areas where it's easiest to first. And ultimately, the city's going to have to make a plan, a long-range plan that does encompass likely, moving back to Samoa Boulevard as sort of like a last line of defense. But the areas that right now house millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure, public and private, produce hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in tax revenues, and house both public and private properties on that South G&H Street Peninsula is the area that we're talking about trying to retain for as long as it is feasible to do so. And so the city's measured retreat strategy is based on considerations both of what's going on with sea level rise, but also what's going on with the financial feasibility of being able to maintain those properties. That investors are taking a risk. They understand they're taking a risk, just like all investors in other areas. They know what the risk is. In fact, we're going to ask them to record on title a notice that, hey, there's a risk here if you purchase this property. There'll be considerations for, for social justice and racial equity when we're making this plan. Right now, that South G&H Street, the residential properties down there house some of the lower income folks in our community. And a lot of that is market rate affordable housing. It's not, it's not a project that the city has invested in. And so we need to take these items all into consideration. We really need to do outreach to those communities and get their opinion as to how the policy that we develop will affect them in the future. And not just sort of knee-jerk react to the fact that, hey, I've got this map that shows that everything is going to be underwater, and so we need to, stop building out here and, in fact, start removing these properties. So again, I think it warrants having a special meeting just on that topic to, kind of remind us of the discussions we've had in the past. But that the direction that we're going with this local coastal program is informed by all of those outreaches that we've done before.
All right, is that it on that topic? Are there any other commissioner comments or questions? We'll look forward to more in upcoming meetings. So I see that we're being visited by Mark Andre. Is he chiming in at this point, or are we moving on, David?
I just noticed he was in the waiting room, so I did bring him in case he had anything to add. There are other attendees, so I'd ask that they raise their hands if they wish to speak on the topic.
Thank you, Mark Andre. No, I was just following your commissioners meeting and listening in, and as an interested person, and in case you requested anything from me, so I'm just here.
Thanks, Mark.
Do you see Judith raising her hand, waving her hand?
Oh, actually, I was waving to Mark Andre. But are there going to be any opportunities to do a fine-tooth comb review of the material that you gave us today, or if we have any comments, should we just send them to staff?
No, absolutely. I think that, again, this is going to be an iterative process, and I'd really appreciate it if you take the materials from your binder and start building your own binder, or retaining them. You now have the first 4 chapters. If you look at your list, you have the first 4 chapters that you can start to compile and go through with your notes, and we'll be having additional public engagement outside of these public hearing or public meetings, and trying to generate some interest in this. And so if there are changes that we're hearing that come from the public, at the last meeting there was a recommendation to include some language around alternative transportation. We're looking at ways to modify that language. Or if the commission has a proposal, we can start to collate these in these meetings. And I think it's perfectly fine to go back a few chapters if we're presenting on chapters 6 through 8 next, and you say, hey, I was reading through chapters 1 through 4, and I want to have a discussion about X, Y, and Z. That's perfectly fine approach.
Anybody else? No? And those members of the public are well aware we're about to close this item and move on, and if they have any comments, right?
I believe so.
Okay.
We do have one public comment. Kristen, you're in the meeting.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm listening. I'm Kristen Kenyon. I work for the North Coast District Office of the Coastal Commission. And yeah, we are definitely going to be looking at how the changes in zoning will be affecting density in more hazardous areas of the coastal zone. That'll be something we'll need analysis of. So that's something we're definitely going to be looking at going forward with the zone changes.
Well, thank you, Kristen. Anything else?
No, I'm just available if you guys have any questions of commission staff.
Any questions of commission staff? Nope, I don't see any. No hands raised, David? No?
And I think,
Okay.
We're just starting to share these materials with Kristen, and I believe she's had them for, little over a week, maybe at the most. We're meeting bi-weekly, that is every other week, to go over these materials. And so there may be some changes that come out of those conversations as well. Coastal Commission staff have been great about getting their recommendations to us, and we've been going back and forth on on those requested changes. So continue to do that.
And David, you said that we will be addressing these over the next 3 or 4 months consistently, chapter by chapter, more or less?
Yeah, exactly. The way that I like to try and, I kind of laid out a rough guideline in the staff report, but I'd like to try and take up, logical clumps of topics. So at the October 13th, we'll be dealing more with like the water quality and biological. We'll then have the public access, scenic and visual resources at that meeting. And then at the next meeting, we'll take up the archaeological and cultural resources. And then agricultural resources, and then that's also when we'll start in on sea level rise. Some of this is subject to change. Right now, we've got a lot of comments about the coastal land use element. From Coastal Commission, we're working to address those at the staff level. Certainly, wouldn't want to bring those forward in the public setting without having at least had that first round, since we've already got comments. We're doing it, as Commissioner and Vice Chair Mayor pointed out, a little bit backwards with the coastal zoning ordinance, in that the Coastal Commission, we don't have the benefit of the Coastal Commission's first blush on the coastal zoning ordinance. But it's necessary that we, process this the way that we are. We need to bring it forward and start having the discussion. Otherwise, we'll find ourselves sometime mid next year and say, okay, well, we haven't done any public outreach yet. We haven't had any conversations. And we've got this document that we'd like to adopt now. So.
All right. Well, thank you, David. And thank you, Kristen and Mark, both for showing up at this meeting. And we have a lot to chew on. And
Vice Chair Mayor had something to say. I think, it's.
Yeah. So on the schedule that you gave us, you're expecting to discuss the coastal land use element at our December 8th meeting. Is that going to be an opportunity to return to the specifics of the zoning and zoning procedures here as well?
Yeah, I think we'll have iterative discussions the whole way through, and I'll bring the coastal land use element in sections as we get those developed as well. And I'm planning on, based on this conversation, having a separate breakout on sea level rise and a separate breakout on what zoning looks like, before then, so that we're not actually looking at the documents, but we can look at the issues.
Okay. Anybody else? Last comments before we close that item and move on? Well, seeing none, we're down to correspondence and communications. Anything from the staff?
I do have just a couple of quick items. One, I wanted to alert you that the City Council took up 5G at their last City Council meeting, 5G small cell technologies. They asked the city attorney to provide them some background and information on small cell technology, and it will require some amendments to our zoning ordinance. So I'd encourage planning commissioners to go back and listen to that meeting. I won't summarize it for you now. But also that request that came out of that meeting was to have a town hall. There's several projects that are going on right now that the community members are curious about how they're going to impact the city and their experience. And so I don't have a date scheduled yet, but we will be scheduling a town hall meeting with the proponents of both the fiber project that's coming through the city of Arcata that is related to the cable landing that'll happen on the Samoa Peninsula, as well as the proponents of the data hub that is being proposed for the old Copeland lumber site on M and 11th. I had fielded several calls from community members curious about what those projects are and what the impacts might be. And so I'll certainly update the Planning Commission as that date is settled. The other thing I wanted to let you know about is the city is starting to work with the Thriving Earth Exchange. We were selected by the Thriving Earth Exchange, which is a organization that matches scientists with communities to solve community problems. And we had our kickoff meeting this week. We're going to be looking at the living shoreline concept and the city's approach to protecting the peninsula and its measured retreat approach. And so we haven't yet been paired with our scientists, but we're kicking that process off right now. And I'm really excited about being able to work with Thriving Earth Exchange to solve some of these problems that really are critical and existential problems for our community. You're muted, Chair.
Oh, is that it, David?
That's all I have.
Okay. Any commissioner correspondence or communications? Seeing none, we will adjourn. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you.